My name is Illyria, and my childhood was filled with privileges that most people can only dream of. We lived in a house that could embody all the ideals of luxury: spacious rooms with high ceilings, through which soft light streamed in, an endlessly beautiful lawn that my father kept in perfect condition, and a pool where extravagant parties were held every summer. Everything was flawless, like something from an interior design magazine. All of this became possible thanks to my father's successes, who had aspired to greatness in business since childhood. I always heard his words, spoken with a firm and confident voice. "We must never forget this, Illyria, my dear. Remember that everything we have comes to us through hard work." This was a lesson he repeated every time we discussed financial matters or when he raised a toast at family dinners. My father's voice was filled with pride, but also authority, with an assurance that could make anyone believe in the inevitability of success. I would nod, trying to understand all his words, but at the age when the world seemed full of bright toys and carefree games with my cousin Lucia, these talks about hard work seemed boring to me. I wasn't interested in how this world was built. I preferred to invent new games. Lucia. She was more to me than just a cousin. We grew up together, almost like sisters, although she was only a year younger. The daughter of my Uncle Mark, my father's younger brother, she was always there. Our families were inseparable, and although our lives with her and her family were externally quite different, I always felt that all of that was just details. My father regularly helped Uncle Mark, and my mother explained to me that families should support each other. This explanation became part of our everyday life. When Lucia and I talked about something, she often said, "We'll go to college together, Illyria. And then we'll live in neighboring apartments, and our children will also be best friends. We'll always be close." I would laugh and agree, just like she did. In our dreams, there were no barriers. We predicted that the future would unfold exactly as we wanted it to. Everything seemed possible when you were young and full of hope, and there wasn't even the slightest hint that all these perfect plans could fall apart. When the day of graduation came, my father once again said something important, as always with a touch of solemnity in his voice, a voice I had probably heard 1,000 times. He announced that he and my mother would pay for Lucia's and my college tuition. All my friends surrounded us, and I felt how this news filled the air with pride and happiness. My mother stood nearby, beaming with pride, and with each word from my father, my heart was filled with a special warmth. "Both of my girls deserve the best education," he said, hugging Lucia and me. Lucia's eyes filled with tears, and I felt something tighten in my chest as she silently thanked us with her gaze. And I just smiled. For me, it felt as natural as life itself. As if it had always been this way and always would be. At that moment, I was certain of one thing: Lucia and I would always be together. We spent every day as though nothing was more important than our dreams. We were planning to conquer the world together. We laughed, making plans for the future, creating entire worlds in our imaginations. And I thought that this world was perfect, and that we were an inseparable part of it. How naive we were. But I didn't think about that, because ahead of us lay nothing but an endless road of opportunities. College was a new beginning. We lived in the dorms, and it was so exciting. Lucia couldn't contain her excitement when we decorated our rooms, our neighbors on the wall, and it all seemed like the embodiment of our hopes and dreams. She shouted with joy, as always, and I just looked at her and believed that nothing could come between us. "Illyria, nothing will ever separate us, right?" she asked, lying on my bed and staring at the ceiling. I nodded, although deep down I felt that the certainty of those words was barely holding up. But could we ever have imagined that anything could destroy our dreams? Could we have imagined that life itself would become our greatest challenge? Now, looking back on it, I realize how blind I was. The world wasn't as it seemed to us. There were cracks in the foundation, but we loved looking at the sky so much that we failed to notice them. College passed by faster than I expected. When I looked back on those years, it seemed like they were just a moment, and yet here I was, standing on stage receiving my diploma. My family was sitting in the audience, and I, unable to hide my excitement, looked at their proud faces. My father, my mother, Lucia, They were all there, and I felt like I was on top of the world. I had finally earned my diploma, and now all doors were open to me. Almost everything, it seemed, was in its place. I started working at a marketing firm, and everything was going smoothly. The world was beneath me, and I felt like I was finally in control of my life. One evening, during dinner, as I sat with my laptop browsing real estate listings, I brought up the subject of getting my own place. The rental market was insane, and I felt it was time to take the next step. I dreamed of having my own little corner, where I could live alone, without parents, but that also meant handling things on my own. "Dad, I think it's time to get my own place," I said, not looking up from the screen. "Rent is just too expensive right now, and with a down payment." Before I could finish, my father abruptly set down his fork and looked at me with his usual, always somewhat stern gaze. "Illyria, you become an independent woman," he said, slightly mocking and with the tone that was so characteristic of him. "Now you have a good job. It's time for you to earn your own living. Your mother and I gave you a wonderful education, but now it's time for you to stand on your own." My mother sat quietly next to him, not saying a word, but her nod confirmed every one of his words. I felt like his gaze hit me in the face, as if I had been slapped. And I knew that this wasn't just advice, it was a lesson. Of course, I understood that eventually I would have to do it, but I never imagined it would hurt so much, to feel suddenly torn away from his protection, from all the security my father had always given me. And so, I found myself in a small one-bedroom apartment, where every penny had to be counted. My savings grew agonizingly slow, half my salary went on rent, and the rest covered food and bills. This was the first real step into independent life, and although there were moments when I began to doubt my strength, I was determined to prove to myself that I could handle it. A year later, when Lucia graduated, we decided to celebrate the occasion at her favorite restaurant. That day, something extraordinary happened to her. Arturo, her boyfriend, dazzlingly handsome and always composed, proposed to her. He got down on one knee, took out a ring, and Lucia screamed in delight. I watched her shine, and my heart tightened with happiness for her. We all became part of this magical moment, and, hardly believing my eyes, I heard her exclaim, "We're getting married in 4 months." The whirlwind of wedding preparations swept us away. Lucia was thrilled with every little detail, from the dress to the selection of dishes for the banquet. And I plunged into the hustle, becoming her main assistant, her maid of honor. I could have felt exhausted, frustrated by my own housing problems, but at that moment, I was genuinely happy for her. Lucia and I had been through so much together, and I couldn't help but rejoice in her happiness. The wedding day came quickly, and, as it seemed to me, nothing could interfere with this perfect event. The ceremony was simply magical, like something out of a fairy tale. At the receptions, among the glowing faces, I saw Lucia dancing with Arturo, and they were glowing with happiness. In that moment, they were the center of the world, and nothing could have been more beautiful. When my father stood up to give a speech, I felt his voice tremble slightly with emotion, but he couldn't hide his pride. He began, addressing Lucia. "You have been like a daughter to me all these years. Watching you grow alongside Illyria has been one of the greatest joys of my life." I smiled, sipping my champagne, and listened to the usual wedding speech, but something in his tone made me uneasy. And then he paused again, as if prolonging the moment. "I want to give you something special, something to start our new life together," he said, drawing the attention of all the guests. He held an envelope in his hand. He raised it above his head, and everyone held their breath. "These are the keys to your own apartment," he said, and as if in slow motion, I felt the champagne glass slip from my hands. The entire room exploded in gasps and applause. Uncle Mark and Aunt Sarah started crying, and Lucia rushed to her father, hugging him. She was sobbing, pressing against his shoulder. "Thank you," she said, and I felt her tears fall onto his shirt. But I sat there, paralyzed, completely alone, watching this moment unfold. All I could hear in my mind was the word unfair. I gripped my champagne glass so tightly that I thought it might shatter. But I kept smiling, kept playing my part. Because it was Lucia's day, and I couldn't let myself ruin it. Exactly 3 days after the wedding, I stood at the door of my house, feeling the pain tighten in my chest. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to ring the bell. My voice was flat, almost cold, when I said we needed to talk. My father opened the door, his face showing no sign of concern, as though what was happening didn't matter at all. He just scanned me with a glance and said, "What's on your mind, Illyria?" I walked past him into the familiar living room, where everything used to feel so cozy, so comforting. I had spent so many happy moments here. But today, the room felt foreign, tense. I stood, unable to sit, so as not to lose my resolve. "Are you really going to pretend you don't know what happened?" I asked, looking straight into his eyes. My father, unhurried, settled into his favorite chair, tilting his head, as he always did when he tried to appear calm. But I knew him too well to not understand that this calmness hid something else. He continued, "Illyria, you're acting irrationally. With Lucia, it's different. She doesn't have the same opportunities you do." I couldn't believe he was saying this seriously. He went on, confident in his righteousness. "She doesn't have a job like yours. You're making your own living. You've said many times that the time to stand on your own has come, and you did everything to get where you are now. Things are settled for you. But Lucia doesn't have the same position. She comes from a poor family, and Arturo can't afford such luxury either. Illyria's family can't help them. You see how they struggle. You have to understand that." There was no pity in his voice, only certainty that he was right. With every word, it became harder to hide my pain. I let out a sharp laugh, trying to smooth over the moment. "Oh, so I can rent half the country, right?" I said, not hiding my sarcasm. "Dad, they could do the same as I did, work, save, and rent an apartment like normal people." But my father just shook his head, and I felt his gaze becoming more and more firm. "You're being mercenary," he said, snapping his fingers as if that was the only argument that could put me in my place. "This isn't about you. It's my money, and I decide how to spend it. I help your uncle's family because they need it. Don't you understand that?" My chest tightened. I couldn't understand how he could say that. Where was the respect he had always shown me? Why was it different now when it came to Lucia? I was ready to shout, but I didn't get the chance. My mother entered the room, and her angry face silenced me. "How dare you question your father's decisions?" Her voice was filled with fury. "You have no right to tell him how to spend his money." I felt like her words pushed me into a wall. It was so absurd and cruel that I could hardly breathe. "Oh, so this is okay with you?" I turned to her, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. "Your husband gave an apartment to another woman's daughter, but told his own to struggle. Don't you see that?" My mother couldn't hold herself back and jumped to her feet. "Don't speak to me in that tone, young lady." Her face turned red with anger. "Do you even realize that your father provided you with everything, and you repay him with nothing but jealousy? Only jealousy. You demand that he treat you with the same care as the others. But you don't see how much effort he's put into you." My eyes boiled with rage. I could barely hold back my tears, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. "This isn't jealousy, Mom. It's respect. How could you do this? I was your daughter, and now I'm just someone you can ignore, someone who doesn't matter. Isn't it your job to treat me with respect, as your child?" In response to my words, silence filled the room. I could feel my voice echoing in every corner of the house. My father, without uttering a word, looked at me with that same expression on his face as if his final decision had already been made. He calmly spoke. "Leave. We can't communicate anymore until you can appreciate everything we've done for you." I didn't know how to feel in that moment. I grabbed my purse, almost unaware of my movements, and headed toward the door. What struck me the most was how sure they were that everything they had done was righteous. I couldn't stay here any longer. When I stepped outside, my legs barely held me up. I got into the car and started driving, but one thought was the only thing in my head. This isn't about money. It's not about that. It was about how I, their own daughter, had been ignored for the sake of another family. It was about the feeling that I had become a stranger in my own home. 5 years can change a lot. And I didn't need another 5 to understand that they had changed almost everything. I built my career. Climbing the corporate ladder at a marketing firm, I became a senior client manager. It was a long and difficult path, but I didn't complain. I was proud of myself. Diligently, day by day, I moved forward, painstakingly putting in my efforts and time into what seemed like a solid foundation for my future. Day by day, I saved enough money to take the first steps toward my dream, though it wasn't enough for a down payment on a home. The market was insane, and every attempt seemed futile. But what truly changed my life was meeting Michael. He entered my life by complete chance when we started working on a project for one of our major clients. He was the creative director, and we collaborated with him, but something clicked between us when he made his proposal that evening. We were cooking dinner at his apartment, joking, making culinary mistakes, and laughing at how clumsy we were at doing simple things. At that moment, I realized I had finally found someone who truly put me first. Not for status, not for any benefits, but simply because I mattered to him. It was an incredible feeling, to know that you could truly trust another person. Planning our wedding began as soon as we set the date. It was early summer, and everything had to be perfect. I threw myself into it with the same determination I applied to everything else in my life. The venue was booked, the dress chosen, everything was going according to plan. But then came the hardest part, making the guest list. I sat down at the kitchen table, the list of names before me, and spent hours contemplating who to invite, who to keep in my life, and who to let go. The decision regarding my parents and Lucia was simple. I hadn't spoken to them in 5 years. Since Lucia had sent me that nasty message on Facebook. It had everything: reproaches, accusations, and judgments. You're just jealous because I have a husband and an apartment, and you have neither. Grow up, Illyria. Maybe if you weren't so bossy, you'd have both by now. But I think some people just can't stand seeing others succeed. It was so vile that I didn't even try to reply. I blocked her, because it was easier. I built a new life. I surrounded myself with people who valued me, who were ready to support me, not judge me. And here I was, sitting in my apartment, looking at flower arrangements for the wedding and choosing between roses and peonies, feeling a tension inside me. I heard the phone ring. My father's name appeared on the screen. My heart skipped a beat, and my hands trembled. 5 years of silence. 5 years without any words. I didn't know what to think, how to feel. Should I answer or ignore it? I chose to answer. Hi, his voice was older, somehow more tired than before. I heard congratulations, he added, and I noticed his voice had become firmer. I knew what he was going to say, but I couldn't believe he was actually going to say it. He continued. Why didn't you invite me to your wedding? I'm your father. I should be the one walking you down the aisle. Bitter laughter escaped me before I could stop it. It was almost impossible to hear his voice, and in it that rehearsed, firm resolve he had built over the years. I cut him off. Really? Now you want to play the father card? You want to act like the good daddy? He paused for a moment, and I felt his breathing grow heavier. Something in this conversation stirred everything I had kept hidden for 5 years. The anger, the resentment, the pain I felt every time I remembered how easily he gave Lucia the apartment and a house that had long been out of reach for me. I couldn't stay silent. Are you going to give me an apartment as a wedding gift? I asked, feeling my words slice through the silence. You know, like you did for Lucia. The silence on the other end of the line was so long that I started to think he had hung up. But then, finally, I heard his voice. Listen, sweetheart, he began, as if carefully choosing his words to avoid upsetting me further. Things haven't been going well lately. I can give you $5,000 for the wedding. It's a generous gift, You should be grateful. $5,000. I could feel my fingers tighten around the phone. It was so humiliating. 5 years of no contact, 5 years without a single word of support, and now he thought that $5,000 would solve everything. I didn't know how to respond. Dad, you gave Lucia an entire apartment. How can you say that? How can you think I'd be satisfied with this? Silence settled over us again, heavy and unyielding. I felt that old, familiar burn of indignation rise in my throat, those feelings I'd so carefully tried to forget, suddenly breaking free like a long-forgotten wound. Some things, it seemed, never changed. The ease with which my father manipulated me and those I cared about was truly painful. His attempts to re-enter my life, his small gestures full of pretense and hypocrisy, all of this flooded back into my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to pull myself together. "Thank you for your generosity, Dad," I said, and despite the bitterness, my voice was filled with sarcasm. "But keep your money, I don't need it." The line cut off before he could say anything, and I stood there holding the phone in hands that trembled slightly. My fingers clutched the cold glass of the screen, and I wondered whether this 5 years of silence was better than what I was facing now, this reminder of why I had severed contact. Why had I left? Why had I tried to start over, surround myself with people who appreciated me, instead of those who had always felt foreign to me? My gaze fixed on the phone screen, and I realized that I didn't want to return to that world I'd long forgotten. But the next morning, a notification popped up on the screen, something that left me no chance of ignoring it. A post. It was a post from my father, something incredibly rare for him, as he almost never made public statements on social media. My heart skipped a beat when I saw his name on the screen, and a familiar chill spread in my stomach. I hadn't expected this. When I opened the post, my hands shook, and my father's words on the screen felt completely alien to me. "I never thought I'd have to write something like this about my own daughter," the post began. And then came words that struck me like a knife. "But Illyria has shown her true face, demanding an apartment as a wedding gift, threatening not to invite me to her wedding if I don't give in to her selfishness and greed. This breaks my heart. What happened to my daughter?" I felt a cold wave of anger wash over me, and my fingers automatically started flying across the keyboard. Instantly, as soon as the words appeared on the screen, it felt like the whole world would judge me. This was my greatest fear, to become the one everyone condemned, the one who appeared before society as an ungrateful, cruel daughter. But hadn't I been dealing with this silence all these years? Hadn't it been my only way to survive in this family? The attention wouldn't let go of me. I typed without thinking, not realizing what I was doing. It was a matter of principle. I typed a reply before I could stop myself. "You gave Lucia an apartment for her wedding. And you think I should just accept $5,000 as my wedding gift? You think I don't deserve the same attention as she does? You think I should remain silent when you behave like I don't even exist?" The words shot across the screen like bullets, and I realized I couldn't stop now. This was my chance to express everything I'd been hiding for years. But as soon as I pressed send, I felt something break inside of me. Almost physically. Like my own world had collapsed, and now there was no going back. But no matter how much I tried to prepare myself, the consequences of my post were nuclear. Almost immediately, my phone exploded with calls and messages. Family, acquaintances, everyone tried to justify, condemn me, laugh or cry. But what was hardest to bear were the comments that rained down like hail. "How ungrateful," Aunt Linda wrote. "You'll never appreciate what was given to you." The tone of these messages was like icy rain, seeping into my soul and twisting out all the hidden feelings. I couldn't understand what had happened. How had I ended up in this situation? People I barely knew began offering their advice and condemnation, without even understanding the issue. What kind of daughter blackmails her father? They wrote on my wall. I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was keep writing. My fingers flew across the keys with frantic speed. When I finished typing, my hands were trembling so much I could barely hold the phone. But something inside me had finally broken. I wrote a second post. Let me tell you all a story that's been bothering me for years. A story about how my father always treated his niece better than his own daughter. Let me list how every birthday of Lucia's was celebrated with lavish parties, while mine were simple family gatherings. When we went on family trips abroad, Dad always took Lucia shopping, buying her new things. I never got pocket money from him. I was always left aside. I kept going, and it felt like an avalanche that could no longer be stopped. These were the words I'd finally let out. Dad paid for her education, and I'm grateful to him for that. He gave her an apartment for her wedding, and told me I needed to stand on my own 2 feet. At Lucia's wedding, she danced her first dance with my father instead of her own. And the more I think about it, the more suspicious the whole situation seems. I wouldn't be surprised if Lucia turned out to be my father's daughter. With that last sentence, I hit send, and my words flew out into the world, carrying everything that had been suppressed for so long. Within hours, my phone was ringing off the hook with calls and messages from every corner of my family, as if pleas, complaints, and reproaches had become the only language left. It felt like a wild tsunami crashing over me, leaving no hope of escape. Some relatives immediately declared they wouldn't come to my wedding, and I, almost without noticing, just nodded as I read another wave of accusations. Each new message seemed to burn and hurt more than the last. First, my mom called. I immediately recognized her voice, sharp as a knife's edge, filled not only with anger but also with despair. How could you do this? Her words struck like hammer blows. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? Your father is devastated. We raised you better than this man. Her voice trembled with emotion. Then came the stream of indignation and accusations that tore at me from the inside. She spoke about how I had ruined the family name, how everything I did only harmed those I loved. And finally, she spat, "You're dead to me." She said it with such contempt that it felt like a wound that would never heal. Aunt Sarah's call was especially venomous. "You become a true addict," she hissed into the phone. "How dare you assume you're just jealous of my daughter's happiness?" Her words were so filled with hatred and fury that it became hard to breathe. And then, a minute later, a message from Lucia popped up. "Congratulations on proving that you're the hysterical paranoid you've become. I feel sorry for your fiancé. He's marrying a crazy woman who makes up 6 stories about her family because she can't stand not being the center of attention. Don't worry about blocking me, I'll do it myself." I froze, staring at the screen. My hands shook so much that I could barely hold the phone. These words were like knives, stabbing into me with each new message, with each new word. I quietly blocked everyone who left offensive comments and messages. The guest list for my wedding became significantly shorter, but I told myself it was probably for the best. It was better than the presence of those who hated and judged me, better than having people around who didn't understand what lay behind this decision. But among all this chaos, amidst all these soul-chilling words, there was one moment I took as a sign. My Uncle Mark remained silent. He didn't call, didn't write, but his silence was somehow strangely comforting, as if I wasn't alone. That silence gave me the little bit of peace I was so desperately seeking at that moment. The next 2 months passed in a blur, where every morning I woke up with the feeling that the world around me had just changed, but hadn't stopped spinning yet. Wedding preparations drained all my energy. Michael was my support through all of it, never questioning my decision to cut ties with the family. He stood by me as I revised seating arrangements and canceled this or that. He was always there, like a calm anchor in a raging sea. And then, on a rainy evening, when the world seemed swallowed up by misty grayness, someone knocked on my door. I got up, not expecting anyone, and opened it. There, on the threshold, stood my Uncle Mark. He looked like he hadn't slept for days. He silently looked at me, then, very quietly, asked, "Can I come in? We need to talk." There was no anger in his voice, no reproach, only a heavy burden that seemed to press on his chest. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I invited him in. He silently walked into the living room, sank heavily onto the couch, and his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white, as if holding on to his last chance. He looked at me, and I could see that this man, usually so confident, was now filled with doubt and fear. "Your post," he began, as if unable to immediately speak the weight of the words. "About how your father treated Lucia." It made me seriously think about everything and remember how he used to tell me about the early years of his marriage to Sarah. He was always around their house, always drove Sarah home from work, saying it wasn't safe for her to take the bus. That was before she got pregnant with Lucia. He always took her with him, bought her expensive gifts. I thought he was just a generous brother. My uncle paused. His voice cracked, like a branch under the weight of snow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope with trembling hands. He handed it to me, and I realized it wasn't just paper. It was something much more important, something that was meant to change everything. "I should have known after your post," he said with pain. "I should have just known." He slowly opened the envelope, and I saw an official laboratory letter. The results of a DNA test. I took the paper in my hands. The results were clear. The genetic match between Uncle Mark and Lucia showed only 84% relation, while my father showed a 99.99% match on the paternal line. Sitting across from me, my uncle let out a heavy sigh. "Sarah confessed everything," he whispered. "Today." His words shook me to my core. They had been having an affair for 25 years. For 25 years, since Lucia was conceived. We sat there until late into the night, piecing together memories that suddenly made terrifying sense. My father's special relationship with Lucia, his extravagant gifts, how he always seemed to know about her life before anyone else. All those times when he insisted on driving Aunt Sarah to her doctor's appointments when she was pregnant. I was in shock, sitting across from this person who had been part of my world, but was now, in a way, a stranger. "I'm so sorry, Illyria," Uncle Mark said, standing up. His voice was full of remorse. He took a step toward the door, then stopped, turned to me, and quietly added, "I should have seen this. I should have known." I stood there for a few moments by the door, until the sound of his footsteps faded away, dissolving into the endless silence of the night. My heart was still pounding from the last confrontation, but I no longer felt pain. Instead, a void was growing, strange, unfamiliar emptiness, as if I had pulled a root out of the ground, leaving the earth inside me. A cold wind struck my face, and I noticed a shiver run through my skin. But it wasn't fear I felt. It was just cold. I closed my eyes again and took a deep breath, letting the silence seep into my thoughts. He was gone. But perhaps I had just walked away from him forever too. How long did I stand there, unmoving? I couldn't say. Time had become stretched, liquefied, like after a long marathon when every movement feels heavy, but still, you keep going. At that moment, fragments of memories came to mind, moment after moment, like frames from an old film I no longer wanted to watch. His firm hand, always ready to stop or direct, his stern gaze, always calculating, always controlling, his silent presence that was like a shadow trailing behind me, even when I thought I had finally freed myself. But now I was free. All the cruel lies, all the masks he wore, had crumbled. And with them, his rights, his power over me. I slowly stepped away from the door and walked toward the kitchen. My gaze inadvertently fell on the glass jar with tea leaves on the table. I wondered how quietly and easily it had all been, just like that, with one conversation, one closed door, I was able to release part of what had held me captive all these years. I could start with tea. That would make sense. But I knew there were many more conversations ahead, and each would be as bitter as the wine my mother and I drank in that cafe. She was still in the process, still trying to digest her guilt, but what could be worse than what had come before? The pain she had hidden was far more agonizing than any confession. After all, no one can make another feel something they don't even recognize. Too much time had passed. My gaze drifted across the room again. It was so familiar, yet so foreign at the same time. The place where I grew up, but now it felt not like a home, but like a museum, shelves gathering dust and fragments of history I no longer believed in. Maybe this was the moment when I began to realize that everything that had kept me here was long gone. These were just fragments of the past, lost their meaning. And then, as if in answer to my thoughts, the phone rang. I picked it up reluctantly, sensing that it was something I wouldn't want to hear. Illyria, my mother's voice, came through. It was hoarse, tired, but with some strange relief in it. I spoke with the lawyer. I'm going to give everything up. Take my share and never come back. It will be hard, but it may be the only way to leave the past behind. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but perhaps this is my way of being honest with myself. I fell silent, not knowing what to say. In that moment, it seemed as though words had lost all meaning. I hadn't expected this turn of events, but now I understood that my mother too was at a crossroads. She had taken a step toward her own freedom, no less than I had. We were both on a new path, and although the road was thorny, I still felt that, at some point, we would meet on it. Not as mother and daughter, not as victims, not as betrayers, but as two people who had both survived their own tragedy and could now move forward. I hung up the phone and felt the tension that had been holding me release. But standing in this empty, nighttime house, I realized that pain doesn't disappear immediately. It just changes its form, hiding in places you least expect. But when I stood before the mirror in my white dress, ready to step into a new life, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just an episode in some endless process that I hadn't fully grasped. As if this whole wedding was just an important step on a path that my father had once started, and that I was continuing, despite everything. Something tightened in my chest, and I remember thinking, at that moment, that maybe this was how it was meant to be, each of us fighting our own battles, even if in different worlds. I had lived through it all, the confessions, the revelations, the ruptures, but at the same time, I felt that, at some point, something serious and important had already come to an end. Here it was, happiness. I looked at myself in the mirror, and suddenly felt a strange but warm confidence that my steps were headed in the right direction. This day was my story, my choice, not imposed, but sincere. A wedding? Yes, but in truth, it was so much more than just a ritual. It was an act of self-discovery, of accepting myself and realizing that I could now be someone else. For a moment, my hands touched my cheeks, and I felt tears in my eyes. But these weren't tears of bitterness or regret, they were tears of relief. He was right. We had all chosen the truth. And even if it was better, even if it destroyed, at some point, it became the only possible choice. Mom, with her eternal support and, finally, the revelations that seemed to save her. Uncle Mark, who from the very beginning had been that support, even when I had long been gone. Time passed unnoticed, and here I was, standing on the threshold of a new life. And in that moment, amidst all the celebration, amidst faces full of love and expectation, I realized that I couldn't, and didn't want to, continue living with the burden of old memories, with the shadows of the past. Everything that was behind me stayed there. Here, with those who chose to come to this moment, was my new reality. I glanced at Uncle Mark, standing in the corner of the hall, and our eyes met. He hadn't changed much, those same warm eyes, always calm, always supportive. He was here, despite everything, despite the betrayal he had been forced to hide for decades, despite the fact that his love had always been expressed through silence, through protection, and quiet support. He had been my salvation, my pillar, and I believed that it mattered to him too. Then, as I looked at all the smiling faces, I realized, they weren't perfect, not all of them were pure, but they were honest, and this was my reality, the one where there was no room for deception or destruction. This was my day, the day when I felt that I had finally freed myself from the past that had held me captive for so long. When the door opened again and I saw everyone who had come, not just family, but old friends too, I understood that they had all gone through their own journeys. We were all in the same boat now, each with our own wounds, with the bitterness of the past, and with some hope, even if it was faint. They were here because they believed that, despite everything, we still had a chance to start over. Perhaps this was the real miracle, that, even after all we had been through, we could all be here, together. I looked at my hand, and the ring sparkled on it. Not the ring he had given me, but another one, the ring that had become a symbol of a new beginning. I knew there were still many difficult moments ahead, but now I was ready. And when everyone stood up to congratulate me, I felt that these were not just words. This was their support, their sincere acknowledgement of my choice. And for a moment, it seemed to me that, even though it all had started in bitterness, it was ending in light. The divorce process between my parents was surprisingly swift. Later, Mom told me that Dad had agreed to all terms, just to end this nightmare as quickly as possible, perhaps hoping to minimize the scandal. They settled the matter out of court, and I, unexpectedly, found myself included in the settlement agreement. Mom received a compensation of $200,000, a sum she had insisted, through her lawyers, that I should receive. I remember sitting in my rented apartment, surrounded by wedding cards I had written and left scattered across the corners of the table, trying to hide from myself that my own future and relationships already seemed distant and almost impossible. One day, as I sat in silence, reflecting on the future and the past, Mom rang the doorbell. Her face was tired, but with a kind of new calmness I hadn't seen before. She entered and, without saying a word, placed an envelope on the coffee table. It was the envelope containing the check for the full settlement, compensation my father owed her. "I want you to take this," she said quietly, and I noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she pressed her fingers against mine. "This is not money. This is what you deserve. This is compensation for all those years when I couldn't stand up for you. You didn't let me down. I let you down, but now we will fix it." With those words, she looked at me with such sincerity that I probably felt, for the first time, the weight of the past few years begin to lift. I couldn't say what I needed or what I thought about this gesture. But I felt something important had changed in both of us. I certainly didn't cry when I deposited the check in the bank, nor when Michael and I found the perfect apartment, the one with the balcony and spacious rooms where we could build a family. But all of it was an important, real moment, and I couldn't help but feel that justice had finally prevailed. We had all tried to fix something. Dad and Aunt Sarah got married last month. I found out by accident when one of the relatives, evidently knowing I wouldn't care, decided to share the news. They said they didn't even wait for the ink on the divorce papers to dry. They no longer hide their relationship. Their social media is now full of pictures where they look like the perfect couple, smiling, holding hands, as if the last 25 years of lies, betrayal, pain, and hidden secrets had never existed. I didn't follow their accounts. I didn't need to. I didn't need to know how they were building their new life on the ruins of the one they had so carefully tried to hide from everyone. It was their life, and I no longer felt like part of it. Most of our relatives had cut ties with Mom and me as soon as the DNA results became public. Those who had defended Dad until the very end now couldn't ignore the fact that their own views and former beliefs had collapsed in an instant. There were no more doubts or excuses. Everything had become too obvious. Even Uncle Mark, who had been my close friend and support all these years, was cautiously returning to life, meeting with us, rebuilding his relationship with Mom. He now saw and understood her pain just as I did. Not just as brother and sister, but as two people whose fate had bound them together by one terrible secret.